My son-in-law pointed his finger at me across my own kitchen table and said, "This is our house now, Lenora. You need to start acting like a guest." I didn't say a word, I just looked at him, and I thought, you have absolutely no idea who you are talking to. Let me back up. My name is Lenora. I'm 67 years old, and I have lived in my house on Clover Hill Road in Asheville, North Carolina, for 31 years. I bought it myself, with money I earned myself, after my husband passed away when my daughter was 9 years old. A ranch-style house with a big front porch and a magnolia tree in the backyard that my daughter used to climb every summer until she was too old to think it was fun anymore. That tree is still there. I planted it the year we moved in. I raised my daughter alone. I want you to understand what that means. There was no safety net, no parents nearby. My mother had passed, my father was in a memory care facility in Knoxville, and I was it, just me. I worked as an office manager for a dental practice for 22 years, and on the side, quietly, the way I do everything, I had been building something else. My husband had left me a small life insurance payout, $40,000. Most people in my position would have used it to get through the year. I used it to buy a duplex 2 miles from my house. I rented both units. 6 years later, I bought a second property, then a third. By the time my daughter graduated from NC State, I owned 6 rental properties in the Asheville area and had just finished paying off the mortgage on Clover Hill Road. Nobody knew. That was intentional. My daughter, I'll call her my daughter because that's what she is, the person I gave everything to. She knew I owned some rental places. She didn't know the scope of it. She didn't know about the LLC I had formed, or the property manager I hired so I didn't have to chase tenants myself anymore, or the fact that the combined value of what I owned had crossed well past a number that would have made her eyes go very wide. I wasn't hiding it out of secrecy for its own sake. I was private about it because I had watched, over and over again, what happened when elderly women revealed what they had. They became targets, not always from strangers. Sometimes from the people who said they loved them. I should have trusted that instinct more completely than I did. My daughter met her husband at a work conference in Charlotte about 6 years ago. He was charming in that loud, confident way that I have always been wary of. The kind of man who tells you within the first 5 minutes that he's in sales and makes it sound like he invented the concept. He had an easy smile and a firm handshake, and he called me ma'am the first time we met, which I appreciated. I told myself I was being too suspicious. I told myself my daughter was a grown woman who had good judgment. They got married 3 years ago in a venue outside Hendersonville. It was a beautiful wedding. I paid for a significant portion of it because my daughter asked and because I wanted her day to be what she'd dreamed of. I sat in the front row. I cried the good kind of tears. I thought, okay, Lenora, this is the next chapter. Let go and let her live her life. They settled into a rental apartment in Charlotte. He was climbing through a sales management position at a tech company. She was doing well in HR. They seemed fine, happy even from what I could tell on the outside. Then, about 14 months ago, my daughter called me on a Sunday afternoon and said they were having some financial trouble. Her husband's company had restructured, he'd been moved to a different territory with lower commission potential, and their rent had gone up significantly at renewal. Could they possibly, just for a little while, stay with me? I said yes. Of course I said yes. She is my daughter. They moved in on a Saturday in March. My son-in-law arrived with a moving truck that was significantly larger than staying for a little while would suggest, but I didn't say anything. I helped carry boxes. I made them dinner that first night. My daughter hugged me in the kitchen and said, "Thank you, Mom. I mean it. We'll be out of your hair in 6 months, tops." 6 months. The first month was manageable, a little crowded. They had taken over the guest room and were using the second bathroom, which was fine. My son-in-law worked from home 3 days a week and had commandeered the dining room table for his setup, which meant I ate my breakfast at the kitchen counter. But I adjusted. I told myself it was temporary. The second month is when the comments started. Small things at first. My son-in-law mentioning that the Wi-Fi was pretty slow and suggesting I upgrade my plan. My daughter saying the mattress in their room was hurting her back and asking if I'd consider replacing it. Fair enough, I thought. I upgraded the Wi-Fi. I bought a new mattress. Then it was the coffee maker. Mine was too slow for their mornings. Then it was the positioning of the television in the living room. My son-in-law wanted to mount it higher. He did it one afternoon while I was out running errands. He didn't ask. I came home to holes in my wall and my television 2 feet higher than I could comfortably watch it. When I mentioned this, my daughter said, "Mom, it looks so much better." Don't be rigid. I stood in my living room, in my house, looking at the television I could no longer comfortably see from my own couch, and I said nothing. I am not a dramatic person. I never have been. I grew up in a household where you did not raise your voice and you did not make scenes, and I have carried that my whole life, for better and for worse. My former colleagues would tell you I was the person who quietly solved every problem before anyone knew there was one. I handle things internally. I absorb, I make a plan. So I absorbed, and I made a plan, but I wasn't ready to use it yet. By month 4, the dynamic in my home had shifted in a way I can only describe as a slow erosion. My son-in-law had begun referring to the house as our place. He told a neighbor, I found out from the neighbor herself, Dorothy across the street, who came to check on me, that they were fixing the house up a bit. He had mentioned to someone at his office that he and his wife were settling into the family property. The family property. I have the deed to that house. It has my name on it, my name only. He began having friends over on Friday nights without asking me, not even mentioning it. I would come downstairs at 8 o'clock and find 4 strange men in my living room watching college football and drinking beer, my coasters not being used, my throw blanket from the armchair draped over someone I had never met. I started spending my evenings in my bedroom. My own bedroom, on the second floor of my own house, door closed, watching television on my laptop because I couldn't see the screen downstairs anymore. My daughter noticed, I think, but she said nothing. That was perhaps the part that hurt the most. Not my son-in-law's behavior, because I had never fully trusted him, but my daughter's silence. Her willingness to let it happen. She had become someone who looked the other way when it was easier than speaking up, and I recognized, with a grief that sat in my chest like a stone, that she had learned that from me. That was a hard thing to reckon with. Month 5 was when it escalated. My son-in-law started talking about the house differently. He mentioned twice that the property values in our neighborhood had shot up and that I was sitting on a gold mine. He said it like a compliment. He said it like something he wanted me to know he knew. He mentioned a friend of his who was a real estate attorney. He said, and I remember this exactly because I wrote it down in the small notebook I keep in my nightstand. You know, Lenora, if you've ever thought about downsizing, the timing couldn't be better. Smaller place, more cash in hand, less to manage. I was 67 years old. I had lived in my house for 31 years. I was not tired. I was not struggling. And I was not going anywhere. I said, I appreciate the thought, and I went to water my garden. But I started paying more attention after that. I began noticing things, small things. He had asked to see a piece of mail that had arrived for me, just to see if it was something important, and I had handed it over without thinking. It was a quarterly statement from my property management company. I watched his eyes move across it before I took it back, and I saw his expression change, just slightly, just for a half second, before he handed it back and said, Looks boring, sorry. It was not boring. I called my attorney the next morning. Her name is Helen, and she has handled my real estate affairs for 11 years, and she is one of 3 people on this earth who knew the full picture of what I had built. I told her what had been happening. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I appreciate about her. When I was done, she said, Lenora, I want you to change your passwords, all of them, today. And I want you to request new copies of all your property deeds and lock them somewhere outside that house. That's when I understood this had become something more than a house guest situation. I did everything, she said. I opened a P.O. box at the post office near my office and had my financial mail rerouted. I changed every password and set up 2-factor authentication on everything. I kept my property documents in a locked box at Helen's office. I was calm about all of it. I had been calm my entire life, but I was paying attention now with a sharpness I hadn't needed in years. 2 weeks after my conversation with Helen, I found out what my son-in-law had actually been doing. He had called my property management company, Ridgeline Property Group, over on Merriman Avenue, and identified himself as my family representative. He had asked for a rental income summary for all my units. He told them he was helping me with my taxes. Gary at Ridgeline called me directly to confirm, because Gary has worked with me for 8 years and he knows I do not have a family representative. Gary is a careful man. I am grateful for careful people. My son-in-law had been trying to map out the exact dimensions of what I owned. I sat in my car in the Ridgeline parking lot after talking to Gary, and I let myself feel it, the full weight of it, for about 4 minutes. The betrayal, the calculation, the fact that this man was sitting in my house, sleeping under my roof, eating food from my refrigerator, and quietly trying to assess what he might be able to access. 4 minutes, then I dried my eyes, called Helen, and told her what Gary had told me. We made a plan. I want to be clear about what kind of plan it was. It was not a revenge plan in the dramatic sense. I am not a dramatic person, as I have said. It was a protection plan, a clarity plan, the kind of plan you make when you have been quiet for long enough and the time has come to speak plainly. The next Saturday morning, I asked my daughter and son-in-law to sit with me at the kitchen table. Just the three of us. I had made coffee, which felt strange in retrospect. I was serving coffee to the people I was about to have a very difficult conversation with. But that is who I am. I set out the cups. I sat down. My son-in-law leaned back in his chair with that easy confidence he wore like a jacket and said, "What's up, Lenora? You look serious." I said, "I am serious." My daughter was already watching me with the eyes of someone who has grown up knowing her mother's silences and what they mean. She looked cautious. I slid a piece of paper across the table to my son-in-law. It was a printout of the inquiry he had made to Ridgeline Property Group. Gary had documented it in writing, including the date, the time, and the exact questions asked. He looked at it. His jaw tightened. He looked up at me. "I can explain that," he said. "I'd like to hear it," I said. He said he was just trying to help. He said he'd noticed I seemed overwhelmed with everything, and he was only trying to get a sense of the big picture so he could offer support. He said he should have asked me first, and he was sorry. He said all of this without looking at my daughter. I said, "That's not all I want to talk about." I told him what I knew, all of it. The mail he'd read, the comments about downsizing, the way he'd been describing my home to other people. I spoke evenly. I didn't raise my voice. I kept my hands flat on the table. My daughter's face had gone pale. When I was done, there was a long silence, and then my son-in-law. And I want you to understand that what he did next is the moment that removed every last hesitation I had. He pushed back from the table, and he pointed his finger at me, and he said, "You know what, Lenora? You've been living in this house like it belongs to some other era. You've been treating us like guests in a place we've been helping to maintain. So maybe instead of coming at me with accusations, you should be thinking about how this arrangement actually works going forward. Because the way I see it, we've been doing you a favor by being here." My daughter said quietly, "Honey," he said, "no, she needs to hear this. This is our house now, Lenora. You need to start acting like a guest." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked at my daughter. She didn't say anything. She looked at the table. I stood up. I went to the kitchen counter and I picked up a manila envelope that I had placed there that morning. I set it down in front of my son-in-law and I said, "Open it." He opened it. Inside was a letter from my attorney on Hartley and Associates letterhead with a very clear and very simple message. As the sole owner of the property at this address, I was formally requesting that both he and my daughter vacate the premises within 60 days. The letter outlined their rights as guests, not tenants, because they had never paid rent, never signed a lease, and the lawful process that would follow if they did not comply. Also in the envelope was a separate document, a summary, not the full picture, because Helen had advised against full disclosure, and she was right. But a sufficient summary of my assets to make one thing absolutely plain. I did not need their help. I did not need their presence. I was not a woman who could be pushed out of her own life. My son-in-law's confident posture left him like air from a punctured tire. He stared at the papers. He looked up at me. He started to say something and stopped. My daughter was crying. Not loudly. She has always cried quietly, like I do. Just tears running down her face and her hands in her lap. I sat back down. I spoke to her, not to him. I said, "I love you. That does not change. But I need you to understand what has been happening in this house, and I need you to understand that I will not accept it." She said, "Mom, I didn't know he." I said, "I think on some level you did, and I think you looked the other way because it was easier, and I need you to sit with that." That was the hardest thing I have ever said to another person. Harder than anything I dealt with in the years after my husband died. Harder than any business decision I've ever made. Because it was true, and we both knew it, and love doesn't make the truth easier. Sometimes it makes it heavier. My son-in-law stood up and left the table. I heard him go upstairs. My daughter and I sat at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking. Eventually she said, "Where are we supposed to go?" I said, "That's something you'll need to figure out together. I'll give you the full 60 days, and if you need a few extra weeks after that, call me and we'll talk about it. But I will need my home back." She nodded. She wiped her face. I refilled her coffee, because that is what I do. I am her mother. Over the next several weeks, things were quiet and strained in the way you might expect. My son-in-law barely looked at me. He spent a lot of time on the phone, and I heard enough to understand he was surprised, genuinely surprised, by what he had seen in that envelope. He had made assumptions, he had miscalculated. He had looked at a 67-year-old woman living alone in a ranch house and decided he understood the full picture. People do that. It used to frustrate me. Now I consider it something close to a professional advantage. My daughter and I had harder conversations in those weeks than we had probably ever had. I learned things about her marriage that I had not known, and she learned things about my life that I had kept private for too long. That part was not easy, but it was necessary. Honesty has a cost and also a value, and I think we had been protecting each other from both for a long time. They moved out on a Thursday, about 7 weeks after that morning at the kitchen table. My son-in-law carried boxes to the moving truck without making eye contact. My daughter hugged me at the door for a long time, and I held on as long as she needed, and when she finally stepped back, her eyes were wet and so were mine. She said, "I'm sorry, Mom," I said. "I know. Me too." I stood on my front porch and watched the truck pull away. Then I went inside and I walked through every room, slowly, the way you do after people leave and the house is yours again. I straightened a picture in the hallway that had been moved slightly and never put back right. I turned the television back down to where I could see it comfortably. I moved my mail from the kitchen counter back to the small table by the front door where I have always kept it. Then I went out to the backyard and I sat under my magnolia tree. I am not a person who spends a lot of time feeling sorry for herself. I don't think self-pity gets you very far, and I say that as someone who has had ample opportunity to practice it. When my husband died, I cried for 6 weeks, and then I got up and I figured out what came next. When the dental practice closed and I was 54 years old and needed a new plan, I cried for about a weekend and then I figured out what came next. But sitting under that magnolia tree that afternoon, I let myself feel it all. The grief of it, the strange particular sadness of having been underestimated by someone inside your own family, the anger that came in waves and then passed, the relief, and there was real relief, of having finally said the things I had been holding in my chest for months. And underneath all of it, something I did not expect, gratitude. Not for what had happened, but for what it had forced me to see. About my daughter, yes, but also about myself, about the way I had made silence into a habit over so many decades that I had stopped noticing when the silence was protecting me and when it was simply letting things happen to me that I should have stopped long before. I am 67 years old. I built something real. I did it quietly and carefully and entirely on my own terms, and I will not be a guest in my own life. My daughter called me the following Sunday. We talked for a long time. She is in therapy now, her choice, not something I suggested, and she said her first session had been harder than she expected. I told her that usually means it's working. We have a long way to go. I know that. I am not naive about the work that kind of repair takes. But she called, and I answered, and we talked for almost 2 hours about things we had never talked about before, and at the end she said, "I want to be someone you can trust, Mom." I said, "I want that too." My son-in-law I have not spoken to since the day they left. I do not know what their future holds, and I have made peace with the fact that it is not my problem to solve. My daughter is an adult. Her choices are her own. All I can do is hold my door open and my standards firm and let her find her own way back. On a Tuesday morning in April, I drove past my duplex on Caldwell Street and noticed that the gutters on the east side needed cleaning. I called Gary. He arranged it by end of week. Then I drove to my property on Haywood Road and walked the perimeter the way I like to do sometimes just to remind myself that it is real, that I built this, slowly and steadily, from a $40,000 inheritance and a decision to pay attention. I drove home to Clover Hill Road and parked in my own driveway. I walked inside. I made coffee at my pace with my coffee maker. I sat in my chair in the living room, in front of my television at the exact height I like, with my blanket from the armchair that belongs to no one but me. And I thought about that finger pointing across my kitchen table and the voice that told me I should start acting like a guest. I thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved. Then I let it go.